should we understand at this critical juncture the role of international governance? What do you think is the most important issue to work on from now on? Professor Goralczyk.
Well, as we know, G20 was a proper idea inaugurated in November 2008 to combine developed countries and developing countries, which emerged pretty soon as the emerging markets. And as we observe what's going on right now, we have dire straits around the globe. Because in the western part of the world we have new phenomena. The most meaningful definitely is the migrant challenge. This leads us to the question, who will lead? If you take into consideration that United Nations, which is the institutional framework to govern for the global governance, was perfect in 1945, but definitely is not perfect for the challenges of 2016. So it seems that maybe this new directorate or board of governors like G20 is a proper solution, at least in economic and financial sense.
Professor Goralczyk asked a great question. That is, who will play the leading role?
At Oxfam, we think that the G20 has the potential to play a leading role. And we saw in London, just after the financial crisis, significant progress from the G20. They made some really dramatic steps in terms of global fiscal stimulus, in terms of helping the poorest nations. Since then, the G20 has been a real disappointment. In fact, we'd like to say the G20 is more of a G0 because you've got no one really doing anything dramatic to tackle the major issues of the day, and particularly the inequality crisis. That's a problem for almost every G20 nation, where the gap between the super rich and everybody else is growing dramatically, which has an impact on economic efficiency and economic growth, and is leaving millions of people behind, which is behind the populism of Donald Trump. Here in the UK, many of the people who voted to leave the EU also feeling very much left behind by the global economy.
Yeah, if I understand right, you're still proposing governments. Governments is the key players that's likely to help us solve the problems. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, it's a governance issue, it's a leadership issue. It's also an issue of turning away from the economics of today and looking for an economics that's benefiting ordinary people.
Professor Goralczyk, very briefly from you, of course, this time we see China as the host of the G20 summit. It put a lot of efforts into the preparations, consultations with everybody. But that does not necessarily going to guarantee the future G20 summits and meetings going to be run in the same way. So, Professor Goralczyk, what do you make of the future of G20?
G20 has a capacity. It's more than 85% of the global GDP, more than 80% of the global trade, more than 70% of inbound investment. So this is the largest community, the largest institution we created. And now when we have some problems in the western part of the world, inequality challenges, so the growth of China is definitely meaningful. The Chinese Silk Roads are in proper direction because we need to have immediate connection. The problem is right now, to my mind, first, inequality, so sustainable development is one of the solutions. Second, we need to have interconnectivity due to the fact that the climate change is already visible on our very own eyes. It is visible everywhere. The same story with with environment. The G20 took place in Hangzhou, which is a symbol of environment, and your Western Lake and the gardens in the neighborhood. This is a challenge of all humankind. Doesn't matter if you are American, Chinese, or Polish in this sense. So we have global challenges, and we need to have a global attitude, global cooperation. It doesn't matter if you are from developing world or developed world, because the challenges are the same for the all humankind.
Mr. Lawson, though, we have to be a little bit realistic. Will the kind of worldly outlook Professor Goralczyk proposed, which certainly is urgently needed, will that become a reality given what we have with the economies and also the current geopolitics?
I think it's very unlikely. I think it's possible. I think with the potential of German leadership of the G20 next year, we could see action, but mainly on these issues where there's economic self-interest. So to take one example, the global problem of tax evasion and tax avoidance by corporations and rich individuals is a problem for the majority of G20 countries. So that would be an action to clamp down on tax avoidance and tax evasion. They're already taking steps in that direction, but they could go much further, and that would make a big difference in terms of the fight against inequality and to deliver the kind of growth that benefits ordinary people.
Yes, indeed. On the other hand, we talk so abstractly over the past few days about international governance. But in your minds, gentlemen, who are the ones and what issues should be really on the top of agenda? We really need to find some on the top of agenda to deal with it first, to gain the lower hanging fruit, to make everybody becoming more confident, to make sure people understand where we're going. Therefore, we can have some result. So, Mr. Lawson, if I ask you to give us a story, give us one person, give us one issue that you think has to be head-on dealt with.
Inequality has grown dramatically in almost every G20 country, but also in some of the poorest countries. I've lived and worked in Africa for Oxfam, and you're seeing a situation in a country like Zambia where they've had 6% growth for 10 years, but there are more poor people now, more people living on less than $2 a day than there were at the beginning of that process. So economic growth is leaving people behind, particularly in some of the poorest countries. For me, the story is about a different economic model and something that really benefits everybody and not just those at the very top.
Professor Goralczyk, what about you? One person, one aspect you think is really going to help out find the threads of solutions?
One person, difficult to say, but one point, I share the view that global inequality is the issue on the global agenda starting from the US, but it is within the states, among the states, and among the continents. We here in Europe, we have a problem with the refugees and migrants, which is also the structural process, which means that Europe is an affluent society, and we have immediate neighborhood, meaning North Africa, not only the Middle East, which is in different kind of reality. So inequality is point number one. Point number two, innovation is absolutely necessary because we have global challenges starting from climate change, and here we need to have more and more, not fossil fuels, but alternative energy sources in all dimensions.
Right.
Here, China is already a leader. European Union is doing well, but the others need to be try to follow our footsteps.
Both of your answers, gentlemen, really reminded me of one crucial issue. That is, it is not true that we don't have solutions. It's whether those solutions will be tapped in by the political leaders, by our current international governance systems, to make sure we're going to have some good results.
I think ensuring that politicians do what they say they're going to do and take leadership is probably the most difficult issue of our age. But I do think that the role of civil society around the world, organisations like Oxfam and others, in pointing out the tremendous problems of the day and holding the G20 to account, calling on them to act and following up on promises that they've made is a key way of ensuring that they do what they've said. So I think there's a pivotal role for social movements, trade unions, civil society around the world in scrutinising the actions of politicians and not letting them get away with doing nothing.
But if I could, Mr. Lawson, follow up, some of the part of the civil society, some parts of the NGOs, some parts of, let's just say, trade unions, according to many, are not necessarily moving things forward, but rather becoming obstacles for international trade and barriers. So what do you make of many of the solutions and sources of solutions you mentioned, and their role now?
Civil society would agree that extreme inequality is a major obstacle that faces the world. I think they would also agree that combating climate change is absolutely vital. I think they speak broadly with one voice on that, and they're demanding greater action from their governments, as we saw in Paris at the climate change conference, and we're seeing on the issue of taxation with the G20. I don't see a big division between civil society organisations. I see a quite united voice that we mustn't let the rich pay no taxes, and we must fix the problem of climate change.
Professor Goralczyk.
I have a little bit different opinion. I share the view that civil society and grassroots level organization is important, but to my mind, what is really necessary for the time being is definitely a strong leadership and vision for the global affairs. Please take into consideration that after 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolvement of the Soviet Union, there was no Vienna Congress or Treaty of Versailles. In legal terms, we have a global disorder. We are out of control, so sorry to say. So I would vote for strong leadership, a vision, and maybe some kind of new global solution, which means new Vienna Congress or new Treaty of Versailles, because in constitutional and institutional and legal terms, we are out of order, sorry to say so.
All right, and we see there are so many different kinds of layers, international organizations, different kinds of platforms, be it worldly or regionally, even bilateral, trilaterally. How should we understand this ever intertwined web? Are they going against one another, or how can we make sure that they are going to work together? What do you think is the critical elements here?
Oh, I think leadership is key. I would agree with that. I think, yes, there are many different institutions out there, but the G20 is potentially by far the most powerful in terms of economic clout. And if they agree to do something, then all the others will follow them. So if the G20 really wanted to end the problem of tax havens, the problem of rich people hiding their wealth, then they could easily do that. They have the power and they have the influence to clamp down on this problem, which is driving inequality across the world. So I think we mustn't underestimate the power of those 20 countries when they decide to do something together.
I see.
As they did in 2009 in London, we saw considerable active effort by the G20, which made a very big difference to a lot of people's lives. So they can do it when they want to.